After overcoming numerous obstacles throughout what is often a rather lengthy quest, it can be quite daunting to square off against the game's final boss. Everything in the story has built up to that single moment, and as the final boss is more often than not the game's big bad, they will make sure to raise the stakes and use everything within their power to seize victory and complete their maniacal scheme. For those who are foolish enough to face these challenges unprepared, the subsequent battles would be rather brutal, one-sided affairs that would force players to retreat back to their most recent save file. And it would be here that they would need to concoct new strategies, grind a bit, or continue questing to try and obtain stronger gear. It's a scenario that many of us have faced throughout our years of playing Final Fantasy games, and that even applies to those who would be classified as more battle-hardened campaigners. Throughout this video, we're going to be running through some of the hardest final bosses that tipped the scales and brought a few surprises to the party, and we're going to kick things off with the Queen of Time Compression, Ultimecia. Throughout the early stages of Final Fantasy VIII, the developers positioned Edea as the primary antagonist. In this role, Edea served as the boss that rounded out Disc 1 at the finale of the fantastic Dealing City Carnival, and Disc 2 after she was confronted as part of the epic battle between the Gardens. But after the conclusion of that second battle, players learned that someone else was pulling the strings, a far more powerful sorceress called Ultimecia who resided in the future and was trying to destroy reality by compressing time. Ultimecia needed to be stopped, but doing so would be no easy task. Not only would players have to traverse through her rather unwelcoming castle, which was littered with restrictions and uncomfortable boss encounters to make it a worthy final dungeon, but if they managed to make it all the way through, they would then have to square off against a sorceress whose strength eclipsed that of Edea and Adele. And this was epitomised by there not being one final boss battle, but 4, with each phase of the fight against Ultimecia becoming progressively more difficult than the last. From the off, Ultimecia would punish players unlike any previous Final Fantasy boss, as she would select random party members for the fight. It meant that if there had been a focus on building up a small selection of protagonists, the player would be punished by taking that approach. Any underlevel characters would be decimated by even the first form of Ultimecia, and they would be removed from the fight with a high degree of swiftness if they were not revived. The first form of Ultimecia also had the ability to eliminate any summoned GF immediately, and she would use a suite of annoying spells like Maelstrom that would reduce the party's health by 2/3 and also inflict the curse status. After being defeated, Ultimecia would then summon her Guardian Force, which was a manifestation of whatever entity Squall deemed to be the most powerful. And to show the power of this new GF, it would have double the HP of Ultimecia and would use Gravijar, a rare spell only wielded by Diablos and the 2-weapon super bosses, and Shockwave Pulsar, Quistis' ultimate blue magic. The GF could also blow away magic reserves, weakening characters if they had the magic junctioned. Upon being defeated, Ultimecia would then merge with the GF to bring about Phase 3, which would see the boss gain around 50% more HP than the previous phase. Alongside powerful spells like Holy, throughout this phase, Ultimecia would focus her efforts on summoning Helix, magic amplifiers that would allow her to use spells like Ultima and Meteor, as well as a unique spell called Great Attractor that would deal huge amounts of non-elemental damage. It is only through defeating this Sorceress GF hybrid that the true form of Ultimecia could be seen, and the battle would take place as the process of time compression was underway. Here Ultimecia would have almost 300,000 HP if the party was above level 65, and it is by far the most difficult phase. Not only does Ultimecia have access to powerful spells like Flare, Meteor and Holy, she can also dispel status effects, kill GFs immediately, and even going one further than the GF phase, she also had the ability to remove an entire stock of spells from a character's inventory, even if it was junctioned. By using Hell's Judgment, Ultimecia also had the ability to reduce the party's HP to 1, and she could also cast the incredibly powerful Apocalypse spell to deal massive damage. It made for a tense and very tough finale, but after watching Ultimecia explode in a waft of colour and sitting back to watch the ending cutscene, it was well worth it. The developers of Final Fantasy IX chose to revert back to only one phase for the final boss, but due to how the gameplay was set up, that didn't make the fight against Necron any less difficult. Whereas many RPGs have a focus on high numbers, Final Fantasy IX provided a gameplay experience that was just as tough, if not tougher, due to the focus on strategy and preparation. It meant that when Necron randomly appeared at the conclusion of Final Fantasy IX, it only had 54,100 HP, but players who underestimated this devilish foe would be staring at a game over screen pretty quickly. Necron had access to a wide range of spells, including most of the third tier elemental spells, as well as Holy and Flare. It could also use plenty of positive status effects such as Protect and Shell, and would heal itself using Curaga periodically if its health was dropping. Necron could also use Blue Shockwave to reduce a single party member's HP to 1, and Neutron Ring that would deal thousands of damage to the entire party. But all of this was just preparation for its ultimate attack, Grand Cross. Compared to many other attacks that have featured throughout the history of Final Fantasy, Grand Cross is one of the worst. It could inflict almost every negative status ailment in the game, including zombie, but it also had a chance of causing instant death. Depending on what you were hit with, it could be very difficult to recover, especially as you'd also need to try and deal with the other assortment of attacks that would follow. And it's this move, Grand Cross, that makes Necron one of the hardest final bosses you can encounter, as you could do everything right and still be on the losing side. Third on our list is Feolthanos Exultant, the final boss from Final Fantasy XII Revenant Wings. We covered this devilish foe in a previous video where we looked at the hardest secret endings to obtain, and Feolthanos was included for good reason, because if you're at 100% completion, then this boss gets a massive stat upgrade. But even without the upgrade, Feolthanos Exultant can be a very challenging foe to square off against. In the actual battle, the end boss is composed of 3 separate parts: Feolthanos Medi, the torso, Feolthanos Dex, the right arm, and Feolthanos Sinis, the left arm. Each part acts as a group leader, has the ability to summon wing wraiths, and when combined, their attacks can deal significant damage. Dex can use the Judgment ability. Every 30 to 40 seconds, this will deal heavy damage to all units, no matter where they are on the field. On top of this, Sinis will use Condemnation, which deals heavy damage to those in the vicinity, and Medi, who will summon Bahamut when threatened, will start to use Faithless Cry once Bahamut has been defeated. Acting as a high tier move, Faithless Cry deals considerable damage to those on an approach path. When combined, all of these elements make Feolthanos a very tough opponent, and not one to be trifled with. And that brings us onto Braska's final Aeon. Technically, Yevon is the final boss of Final Fantasy X, but since it's near impossible to lose that fight, we're taking a slight step backwards to focus on the fight that comes just before, which can pose a significant challenge if unprepared for what lies ahead. Braska's final Aeon is fought in 2 separate stages, and it's encountered after traversing all the way through Sin. What makes this fight challenging in the initial sense is the U Pagodas. They use a move called Power Wave, which removes negative status effects and heals the final Aeon for 1,500 damage, as well as increasing the final Aeon's overdrive gauge by 20% each time. On top of this, players also have to contend with Eject Beam, which can petrify and shatter their characters, Triumphant Grasp, which will target non-petrified players to deal high damage, along with a chance to inflict zombie status, and Eject Bomber, its overdrive that can deal a considerable amount of damage. It means there is a lot of micromanagement, as you need to focus on keeping the party alive, while also attempting to deal more damage than the final Aeon can heal for. If your characters are strong enough during this first phase, the final Aeon will then draw a huge sword from its chest, a weapon that it will use to deal damage to the entire party, while also delaying their turn. Its standard moves from the first phase can also deal an increased amount of damage, and it really ups the ante as the fight reaches its conclusion. What's interesting about this particular fight though is the tipping point. If you go into the fight too weak, it can be a very demoralizing experience to realize that you just can't make an impact and break out of the cycle. You may be able to sustain and not lose, but you also know you can't win. But if you've taken the time to obtain a few celestial weapons and can break damage, then the final Aeon will not pose that much of a threat. The entire Final Fantasy XIII trilogy has a nasty selection of final bosses, but the final boss of Lightning Returns takes the crown when it comes to posing an uncomfortably difficult challenge. Taking a leaf out of Ultimecia's book, Bhunivelze is a fight that takes place over 4 phases of increasing difficulty, and to emphasise that time is of the essence, unlike some of the other bosses throughout the trilogy where Doom would only be cast on the player if they were taking too long, for this particular fight, Bhunivelze would cast Doom right from the off, and should lightning fall, Doom would be reapplied with a shorter time counter. Throughout the first phase, where Bhunivelze has 600,000 health on normal difficulty, a wide selection of moves will be used, including Give a Graviton and a handful of debuffs. It will also throw its Scythe, dealing increasing damage if lightning moves far away, penalising players who are perhaps trying to catch a breather and recuperate. In the second phase, Bhunivelze has 700,000 health and summons monads that follow lightning around and can be detonated to deal significant damage. The player will also be punished for drifting too far away from Bhunivelze, this time with Genethliac Hymn, which grants the boss lots of immunities while summoning lightning bolts across the map. Bhunivelze can also use a move called Dancing Mad if not staggered quickly enough, which deals considerable damage, and it can also use a wide range of high tier elemental magic. The third phase, which sees Bhunivelze have 900,000 health, sees the boss increase its arsenal with a new suite of moves, including Ultima, Divine Punishment and Hypernova. Out of the three, Hypernova is by far the most lethal, and these moves are intermixed with standard physical attacks that are a bit more irregular than the two previous phases. And that brings us to the final phase, which represents a significant step up in terms of challenge. Bhunivelze now has over 1 million health, debuffs are completely ineffective, and damage can only really be dealt when Bhunivelze is staggered, as it's heavily armoured when in its normal state. Its damage output also gets ramped up, with Disaster and Cataclysm being rather nasty, and Divine Efflux can cause problems if you aren't able to anticipate it effectively. But the most devastating move is Damnatio Memoriae, a move that if not blocked in the initial phase, sees the second part become unblockable and likely fatal. In total, it makes the fight against Bhunivelze pretty rough, and that's without even talking about the enhanced version called Bhunivelze Plus, which can be accessed in New Game Plus if the player has completed the ultimate layer. In the realm of the MMO, there have been numerous final bosses, as with each expansion, a new story arc begins. But across them all, we have chosen to go with the Warrior of Light from Final Fantasy XIV, who appeared in Seat of Sacrifice, a level 80 trial at the conclusion of Shadowbringers. It's a boss that, without correct preparation, can pose a significant challenge due to the variety and harsh nature of the moves used by the Warrior of Light across its two phases. Terror Unleashed, for example, reduces all players to 1 HP and afflicts them with the True Walking Dead debuff that will kill any player who's not healed up to full HP before the timer runs out. The Warrior of Light will also use Absolute Fire 3, which applies the Pyretic debuff that penalises players for taking action until the debuff disappears, and Absolute Blizzard 3, which does the opposite, penalising players for staying still. After being reduced to less than 50% HP, the Warrior of Light will use Ascendance, which sends all the players into an active time maneuver where if a single player fails, the party will wipe. This is then followed by an attack called Ultimate Crossover, which will also wipe the party unless a player tank unleashes a level 3 tank limit break, as this is the only way to mitigate the damage. The second phase then requires a lot more micromanagement, with coordination needed to share the damage of moves like Absolute Holy and Radiant Braver. There are also numerous AoE attacks to avoid throughout, as well as the summoning of Bahamut, who will use Dive Bomb on half the arena. It makes for an incredibly hectic fight with numerous overlapping mechanics. You may need to try and dodge multiple Bahamuts while being afflicted by Absolute Blizzard or Fire, and while also attempting to avoid meteors that have been summoned. But if you can defeat the Warrior of Light, you'll see the conclusion to an awesome storyline, and you can get prepared to tackle the extreme version of the raid, where the various moves are much more devilish. And that brings us on to the final boss in our list, NeoExdeath, who usurps XIII at the conclusion of Final Fantasy V as a rather nasty surprise for players who thought they'd already won the day. The fight against XIII is challenging, but if you have a decent party setup, it's possible to make it through without too much trouble, and it can provide you with a lot of false confidence when progressing to the second fight. But that confidence evaporates pretty quickly if you don't have an aggressive party setup that can deal enough damage while mitigating the onslaught that NeoExdeath will throw at you. Unlike XIII, NeoExdeath has 4 parts, each of which has between 50,000 and 60,000 health, a significant hike up in comparison to XIII itself and many of the other bosses you would have previously faced along the way. And to make matters worse, due to there being 4 parts, they attack pretty quickly, using a variety of physical and magic attacks combined with buffs and debuffs. NeoExdeath can also make use of Grand Cross and Almagest, which can perform a significant amount of damage to the entire party, while also placing negative status effects on them like Sap and Zombie. NeoExdeath does have some weaknesses that can be exploited though, such as the middle section, which can be petrified using the Mystic Knight's Break Blade. but if you don't have either the sustain or the damage output, NeoExdeath can wipe a party with relative ease, and what makes it worse is that the difficulty is such a significant hike up in comparison to XIII that it can be really demoralizing, as the only real solution is to grind character levels and master jobs. But yeah, I think with that we're done. They were 7 of the hardest final bosses that can be faced across the Final Fantasy franchise. Let us know in the comments below which you found to be the most challenging, and of course, if you enjoyed the video, please be sure to hit that like button and subscribe to our channel. Alright guys, this is Daryl signing out. I'd like to extend a big thank you to all of our Patreon and YouTube membership supporters, especially Raining Ekham, Logan Nijay, Benjamin Snow, and Gregory, who are super special Onion Knight supporters, and of course, a big thank you to everyone for watching this video. I'll see you all again soon for more Final Fantasy goodness.